Hi everyone, I'm really excited to share today's training with you because it's really innovative and powerful stuff that will likely radically change how you view leadership. What you learn today will form the basis for everything else we talk about in the rest of the course, and most people find it really helpful to watch it more than once to take it all in. So let's get going. This is you. You're a leader. You have big, important things to accomplish with your teams. You want yourself and your people to be successful, happy, high achievers that know no limits. But every day you come in and important things haven't been done. Not enough progress has been made. People aren't motivated. You feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders or hitting your head on a brick wall. This is heavy and draining and painful. On top of that, when people don't perform well, it also puts your career on the line. When the numbers don't look good, the leader is often the first person to go. But what would it be like if you knew how to get amazing performance out of most any team? If you could get each person growing and contributing and excited, your energy would be high, you'd have fun, and you'd feel deeply fulfilled every time you saw someone grow and achieve something they couldn't achieve before. Your teams would accomplish a lot. When you can do this, it's like you have the touch of gold, and your superiors want you taking on more. But right now, you're probably feeling leadership stress. You feel stuck and like there's no way to get there. Instead, your time is sucked up with petty problems. One team member is always getting everybody else upset. Another one spends enormous amounts of time explaining in great detail how things aren't working. And another one just will not complete some of her work no matter how many times you tell her to. So what's a leader to do? First, you have to understand the real problems. The biggest problems you have to deal with aren't those technical problems your team has to solve, nor are they those petty issues that people waste so much time on. They're about motivation and focus and fear and stress. They're problems of people not being able to keep moving forward under emotional pressure. Movement is fundamental to life, and the more that we can incorporate things that cause resistance to movement, like technical problems or people issues or fear of the unknown, into our movement, the stronger and better that we feel. And when we cannot do that, we feel low energy, low motivation, and stress. What we want is to move and to not get stuck or uncoordinated in uncomfortable situations. We want to not lock up or shut down or run away or fight back under pressure. And when we do feel stuck, it manifests as all those other issues. As a leader, you get stuck just as much as your people do. I mean, think about it. Do you evade prioritizing work? Do you sometimes yell at people and then feel awful afterwards? Do you complain about people complaining? Do you engage in wish leadership? I wish people would get along. I wish people would do their work. I wish I didn't have to confront Anne about her performance. If so, it's because you're human. And these are problems all humans face, regardless of the work they're doing. But they're also problems that we can solve. It's highly likely that your leadership stress stems from bad information or no information about how motivation works. It comes from not understanding drive. Now, you've probably found out the hard way that authority, which is really the ability to use pain and loss to get results, is a lot of work, feels terrible, and doesn't really get you very far, especially since people nowadays have become less and less tolerant of it. You've probably also found out the hard way that although everybody lately is teaching you to be sensitive and kind, the actual improvement in results is pretty minimal. And you've probably never been taught the equation for drive. All you've heard is, if people don't want to do something, what can you do? The problem with all that is when people's fundamental issues revolve around motivation and focus and fear and stress, you can't possibly improve those by using the threat of pain and loss, nor can you improve them by being nice. So unless you understand a third way of getting action to happen, you're pretty powerless. But today, I'm going to show you a model that will make you beautifully powerful. A model that blows away the power of pain. I'm going to give you the equation for drive. This equation is also the key to just plain having a lot more energy for you and your people, far more than the boost that you get from better food or sleep. And I'm also going to tell you the right time to stop doing it and instead remove someone from your team or organization. The model I'm teaching you today is simple, but it's not easy. It will require a significant amount of growth in yourself, plus gaining some expertise in navigating human complexity. Now, we'll be using your chosen leadership project, the one that we zero in on your first one-on-one, to develop all of this. But today is going to be just about what you need to do, and then we'll spend the rest of the 8 weeks on how to do it. So don't get too hung up on that part yet. Just focus on what you need to do for today. Let's start by defining what leadership actually is. To truly understand leadership, I think we need to define it by what it does, by the fundamental change that occurs when a leader steps in, not by what the leader has, like vision or influence or charisma, followers, authority. Leadership, in any useful sense, is a verb, not a noun. And leadership has nothing to do with titles. Leadership is something you actually do. Most people can get other people to do things when everything is going just right, when there's total agreement, clear goals and action, there's no problems to solve. But that's really just coordination. It's not leadership. Leadership is needed when there's a problem. Leadership is needed when people disagree, when the necessary actions aren't completely clear, when things aren't getting done, when people aren't yet capable, when things aren't working. In other words, leadership is needed when there's stress involved. In fact, leadership is needed because there's stress involved. So leadership is the channeling of people's stress energy into the flowing energy of focused work. A leader's job is to change the energy. Nearly all problems boil down to not enough drive to overcome the obstacles. When people are evading doing work like it's a plague, it's because they don't want the result badly enough to overcome their resistance. When people forget to do things, it's because they don't want the result badly enough to remember, even though the result is good for them. When people are very negative, always fighting or constantly chasing shiny objects, it's because they don't want the result badly enough to focus on what they need to do. Because when people totally commit to getting something, they can always find a way to do it. They become extremely resourceful. A great leader is one who gets this to happen. Drive isn't something that people have or don't have. It's an equation with variables you can understand and tweak. I'm going to tell you that equation now, but you'll come to understand it as we move through the rest of the presentation. So the equation for drive is the physical, mental, and emotional grounding and suppleness of the person in relation to some stimulus, plus the strength of the emotional relevance of that stimulus, plus the stakes. Those equal how much drive a person has. Once you understand drive, you realize that drive is the only real obstacle. When people get into a state of high drive, all other obstacles become challenges. They become a summons to engage. This is true for yourself and your team members. Instead of, I can't make such a big change, it becomes, how can I make such a big change? Instead of, they'll never agree to this, it becomes, I wonder what would happen if I presented it this way. There are many challenges you and your people will face, but there's only one obstacle. The obstacle of drive is an obstacle of movement. It's about whether or not you can move well, whether or not you can keep moving smoothly forward under emotional pressure. And more than that, it's about being able to actually use emotional pressure to increase your capacity to move well. So instead of backing away from those mountains you and your people need to climb, you perceive them as an enticing challenge to grow. Now, before I explain the model for what makes us move or not and in what way, I need to give you a little background because this is really groundbreaking stuff. The model I'm teaching you is very powerful for helping people to tackle more and bigger things in a positive way. And I can virtually guarantee that you've never seen it before because not only is it cutting edge, but it also took a really odd combination of the work of 3 very different people to bring it to fruition. It took a dog trainer, a physicist, and a corporate leader who learns about leadership from horses. That's myself. Now, as someone who was deeply inspired at the age of 11 by the beautiful leadership of a horse trainer who used no force to train his horses, I always intuitively saw the connection between leadership, beauty, and moving well. And I even had a massive aha about the positive role stress plays in all of this a couple of years earlier. But I had no conscious idea of the depth of meaning behind moving well until I came across Kevin Bean, a brilliant dog trainer and the equally brilliant physicist he introduced me to, Adrian Bijan. Kevin has combined his revolutionary work in rehabilitating highly aggressive dogs with a study of thermodynamics via Professor Adrian's relatively recent discovery of the constructal law. I'm not going to go into what that all is here, but you can look it up online. There's tons of information about it all over the place. And with those two keys, Kevin came up with his theory of the thermodynamics of emotion, which he calls the immediate moment theory. Kevin developed this theory working with dogs, but it's equally applicable to humans. Of course, we have to factor in the complexity and nuances that our rational minds add to this, but the underpinnings of behavior in all animals is really the same. And for myself, as someone who returned to my farm and to nature and a study of animals in my quest for the answer to what makes leadership beautiful, I can absolutely say that this is true. So the software is different animal to animal, but the basic code that runs that software is all the same. And once you understand that code, the world changes for you. I think Kevin is one of the great thinkers of our time, and this information is really important. It's the lens through which you view and understand everything. And as a model for behavior, it is phenomenally more accurate and useful than anything else I've studied. As testament to that, there is a continuous flow of new scientific data coming out from the fields of psychology, neurology, biology, and even physics that corroborates the tenets of Kevin's theory. If you want more information on this, I highly recommend you watch the videos from a conference on this subject. Just look for the Thermodynamics of Emotion Symposium on YouTube, and I'll also put the links down below. What I'm teaching you today, though, is my own interpretation and application of Kevin's theory, but to humans and to leadership. So for right now, I want you to forget about everyone you lead and just get in touch with your own energy, with your own ability to move. You'll really have the deepest understanding on yourself, and you're going to need to utilize your own capacity to move well in order to help others to move well. So you cannot skip this step. All right. Have you ever noticed how we describe our inner states in terms of motion? It's like being on cloud 9. The weight of the world is on my shoulders. Let me digest that information. My creative juices are flowing. It's like hitting a brick wall. Well, knock me over with a feather. Thoughts were dancing in my head. I need to channel my energy. It took my breath away. I've just been dragging my feet on this. I'm giddy with excitement. I'm digging in my heels. That just blew me away. But the bottom line is this. We experience energy as a wave of force acting on us. The actions we take, or not, define our behavior. Behavior is movement. Even if you're very still, we still define your behavior by how you're moving. If someone's behavior is rude or shy or ambitious or remarkable, it's how they're moving that we're talking about. So behavior is movement, and movement equals behavior. And the fact that we can discern emotion by the configuration of limbs on a stick person speaks volumes to that. Movement is an expression of energy, and all energy moves as waves. There are heat waves, light waves, sound waves, water moves in waves, locomotion is waves, flying, swimming, running, and this is why we feel a wave of emotion come over us. Emotion is energy in motion, and we experience it as a force acting on us, like waves of water. To move well means to move in a smooth wave, because that is the most efficient way for all energy to be transferred. The problem of moving well for sentient beings, like humans, is the problem of being able to maintain a smooth locomotive wave under emotional pressure. It's about being able to keep taking efficient action in the face of anything, material or non-material, that causes us to feel emotional resistance. All interactions are a transfer of force, and in sentient beings, emotions gate that transfer. They start it or stop it and tell it which direction to go. Our behavior, whether we move or not and in what way, is a nuanced expression of the forces we feel and cannot be otherwise. And the goal of the interactions is to increase the energy in the system or the network. The system can be the human body, your home, the workplace, or the entire world, however you choose to define that. But the goal is to increase the energy in the system rather than let it dissipate. This is why we feel so good when we're able to integrate resistance of any kind into our motion, because being able to integrate or incorporate it makes us more capable of flowing more energy instead of letting it get stuck or dissipate. Flowing more energy makes you feel lighter. And this is why after we've overcome resistance and successfully integrated it into our movement, we say it's like walking on air. But what happens when you can't successfully integrate it? Such as when your boss or your own beliefs are telling you to do something, but the results always seem to be negative. This feels like hitting a brick wall. Now, how does all this work anyway? How do we experience this force? Well, we'll start by looking at two variables. There's you and there's a stimulus. A stimulus is anything, material or non-material, that's emotionally relevant to you. It's anything that causes increased energy and attention. And it's either compelling or repelling. It's attractive or repulsive. Emotionally relevant is about emotion. It means energy in motion. A stimulus is something that causes a change in your movement. In a later module, we're going to dive into the fascinating answer to what causes something to be emotionally relevant. And the full answer to this is pretty mind-blowing, but I'll give you a hint. If you remember what I said from the introduction to this course, it's what I cover in my favorite module. But you'll understand that much better if you take this in more simply at first and just learn to feel what I'm talking about for starters. So for right now, we're going to look at what makes something compelling or repelling. The stimulus itself is neutral. It's the emotional relevance that gives it a charge. If you feel that you can overcome something, which means to integrate it or incorporate it into smooth forward movement, then you will find it compelling, because integrating it makes you stronger and more capable of creating more flow. The constructal law shows us that all systems, including our emotional system, morph and change over time to more efficiently and effectively accommodate the flow of energy. And the capacity to incorporate things that would otherwise thwart the flow of energy is good for life. It makes us resilient and able to stick around. Now, if you feel that you cannot integrate it, you will be repelled because it will hinder or possibly even end your ability to move smoothly forward. These are assessments of force, of energy, and they happen instantly and outside of thought. Thank goodness, because thinking is a very slow process. This is why you automatically swerve away from an oncoming car that just crossed into your lane. It's not what you think about the situation, it's what you feel about the situation. And part of the complexity of humans is that this thinking and feeling can be in agreement or in conflict, but you can't achieve happiness while ignoring the forces you feel, because these are the gate for motion. They're the gate for action. What makes you perceive whether you can integrate it or not is part of an equation that we'll get into later. But for starters, let's look at a simple example. A chair in the hallway. If you're walking down the hall and there's a chair in your path, you'll go around the chair. It's repelling to you because it interrupts your ability to move smoothly forward. But if you're in a meeting and short one chair, you'll be attracted to that chair out in the hallway just outside the door, and you'll go get it. These are not things you have to think about. The chair automatically has emotional relevance because it affects your ability to move. And it will automatically be attractive or repulsive based on whether or not you can incorporate it into your movement. And by the way, movement doesn't have to be literally walking or running. You can be moving ideas forward or creating greater flow for future actions by having a well-run meeting. Now, a little more complex example of this would be if you're talking about a new brilliant idea you just had for your team to embark on, and one of your team members frowns. If you're not highly grounded and certain of what you're doing, you'll quickly back away from your course. This frown will feel disturbing and it will repel you. But if you're very confident and secure in your ability to do the right thing, you'll perceive the frown as a call to action. It's a summons to engage this feeling and get to the bottom of it in a positive way. You'll be attracted by the information of the frown and take on the challenge. Being attracted or repelled is pretty straightforward, but oftentimes we feel a mix of these two. And that is where we get stuck and accumulate stress. Let's look at some of the forces that hinder our ability to move towards or away from things, starting with that brick wall again. I'm talking about them as if they're happening to you, but of course they apply equally to all of your team members. Everyone has these same problems, just depending on which role you're in, the stimulus or the trigger will be different. So with that brick wall, here's what's happening. There's a stimulus. Let's say it's a meeting you're supposed to attend. You feel compelled to go to the meeting. Important next steps are supposed to be decided there, and also your boss expects you to attend. But at the same time, you feel repelled by that meeting because usually it's just a time for complaining and passing the buck, and it makes you feel icky. When the force or the intensity of each of those feelings is equal, then you are emotionally hitting a brick wall. This is why we say that meeting is painful. Fixing this will require increasing the disparity between the compelling and repelling nature of it for you so that you can either attend and take action or walk away from it without further worry, like going around the chair. We'll be talking about how to do that at a later time. Another force you might feel is when you're anticipating something negative, but it was unexpectedly positive. Like when your boss calls you into his office and you think he's mad about something, but then he tells you you're going to get a promotion. You say, well, knock me down with a feather. This happens because your center of gravity goes up when you're anticipating something negative, but then when it's unexpectedly good, you kind of soften a bit, but you still tip over because your center of gravity was too high. The force that you feel is being knocked down, but by something very light. This can be pleasant. Just get up and enjoy it. But if it happens to you a lot, it does prevent you or your people from moving forward. You need to start including the possibility of a positive outcome in your thinking and increase your grounding and your centeredness so you're not so easily knocked over by every little thing, even if it's good. And another thing is when you take on everyone else's stucknesses in lieu of facing your own, you feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. This happens when the stimulus you're facing is causing a diminished sense of self, and then you cling to a connection to self vicariously by taking on everyone else's stucknesses instead. People that are naturally nurturing have a really high propensity for doing this, but we all do it from time to time. One of the biggest counters to it is to bolster your sense of self, to bolster your grounding in who you are and your purpose. Gaining centeredness will bring certainty and the ability to face your own problems head on. Another great example is what happens when you think you should be doing something or when everyone is telling you you should be doing it, but it just doesn't quite feel right. The force feels like you're dragging your feet. It happens when you're being pushed or pulled towards something by your own beliefs or by pressure from others, but you can't discern if the feeling you'll get once you've incorporated this is actually good. So your mind is kind of ahead of your heart and your gut, making it feel like you're dragging your feet. There's a sense that the feeling on the other side is either equal to or potentially worse than the feeling you currently have, so it's just not worth the effort of engaging. That's the force that you feel. This often happens with new ideas that haven't been thought through to their logical conclusion or haven't been scenario tested. And honestly, the gut feel here is right at least as often as it's wrong. So it's something you should pay attention to. One of the things that can most help is getting clarity about how the current state actually feels versus how the future state is likely to actually feel, and increasing the disparity between the two. So all of these forms of stucknesses revolve around internal or external dissonance. We feel one thing, but our mind or something or somebody outside of us is telling us otherwise. The stimulus is increasing our energy and attention, but we can't act because of the dissonance. This is good because when what you feel is different from what seems to be going on or for what's going on inside your head or from what others are telling you, it's not necessarily the best thing to do what they say. You need to resolve that dissonance first. Often this really boils down to just shutting up the mostly untrue stories we tell ourselves in our heads, but there are other reasons too, so you should pay attention to it. In order for movement to happen, there has to be a perceived polarity difference between where you are now and where you're going. And it has to be in the direction of increased access to flow or stopping a decreasing access to flow. It has to be beneficial. So if you cannot feel a polarity difference, action doesn't happen. This is equilibrium. Okay, now we're going to move on from general stuckness to the big kahuna. When the stimulus overloads your system, it causes a collapse of your feeling of connection with it. You literally experience a loss of your sense of self in the presence of the stimulus. And this loss feels like falling, and it's called fear. Fear happens when you no longer have a reference for what it means to move well towards or away from the stimulus because you've lost your sense of self and connection with the stimulus. And fear triggers instinct. It triggers fight, flight, or freeze because given the loss of connection, you can't feel what you should do. You can't feel any transfer of energy, so you don't get any feedback on where you're going. So you resort to pre-programmed things inside of you. Fear-induced instinctual responses can manifest in any number of ways. It can be refusing to explain why, it can be running from the need to prioritize, it can be yelling at people, it can be picking fights or refusing to comply with reasonable requests. It can be believing that you're sick and can't go into work. Understanding fear, understanding this loss of sense of self in relation to others is really important for leaders for two reasons. One is that fear in your people is very common and usually misdiagnosed, which means your responses are ineffective. If you're responding to something that you think is not fear, but it really is fear, then it's ineffective. And the other is that I believe this is the primary reason that we as leaders resort to the use of authority. We resort to the power to cause suffering and loss when working with others. Fear is a big problem, and the biggest antidote to fear is fortitude. It's developing a very strong sense of self that creates a safe place from which you can approach potential pain and adversity without losing your reference of self in relation to stimulus. It's really important to discern the difference between someone who's lost the sense of connection, the sense of self in relation to stimulus, and is thus locked in fear, versus someone who still has a sense of connection but is stuck between conflicting feelings of force. Because when someone's in a state of fear, there's nothing you can do until you reestablish connection. The connection itself becomes a priority, and their lack of fortitude is their biggest problem, not the other variables. Fear is a far more common problem than we acknowledge, and the reason why so much of what we do to get movement just doesn't work. The difference between fear and stress is connection, the sense of self in relation to stimulus. Both states are an accumulation of energy. Both are states where energy is not flowing well, but in the case of stress, you maintain the connection. You're stuck because you feel conflicting forces, so there's an uncomfortable accumulation of energy, but the connection is still there. In the case of fear, the connection is lost, so you can't move smoothly and efficiently towards or away from the stimulus because you don't get any feedback. The reference is just gone, hence the feeling of falling. Now, we've seen a lot of ways you can feel hindered or blocked in your movement in relation to a stimulus. You can feel conflicting forces or equilibrium in connection with a stimulus, which causes energy to accumulate in this stuck place and feels like things such as hitting a brick wall, being knocked down by a feather, carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, or dragging your feet. And you can experience overload and lose connection with the stimulus, so you have no reference for moving well, which feels like fear, which is fear. But what happens if you successfully incorporate the stimulus into smooth forward movement? What happens if one of your engineers finally figures out why that tool mysteriously scraps expensive product every few weeks? What happens when you finally do something that really gets your people aligned and fueling each other's work? You become stronger and more capable, and you feel like you're walking on air. This is what we're all aiming for, that feeling of floating. The force we desire, the one we want to feel, is that of lightness, of weightlessness. Kevin's theory, which I love, is that we're striving to return to the feeling we originally had in the womb, the feeling of weightlessness. That's our reference. That's cool. Now, another thing you might feel is an aha. You might have that jolt of energy accompanied by a gesture and sometimes even raised hair on your arms. That jolt is because of the tremendous increase in your capacity to flow energy when you finally integrate the information into your movement. To know something is to think it, but to understand it is to feel it. Only then is the information useful to you, when it informs your movement. You can also move well in a smooth way away from something that you feel you cannot incorporate, something that would hinder or even end your ability to increase your capacity to flow energy, such as an oncoming car or a detrimental idea. This is drive, but it's drive away from instead of drive towards. When you move well away from something, it does not cause lasting stress and insecurity. Once you've gotten away, you're safe and you're done with it. There's no stuck energy and you didn't lose your connection. When we successfully move away from something that we truly cannot integrate, it feels good. It feels really good. It's not the same as walking on air, but it's a feeling of strength and confidence and courage, and it's an increased capacity to deal with obstacles. So what all of this boils down to is there's a stimulus, something that's emotionally relevant, and it makes us feel either blocked, afraid, or driven. And the forces we feel act as the gate for action. They tell us whether to move or not, and which direction to go. Whether we act or not, and in what way, depends entirely on the forces we feel in the moment. Our thinking is a variable in those forces, but we can't act by thinking in lieu of feeling. We cannot separate feeling from action because emotion is the gate. But you can influence the variables in the equation of that feeling. And since drive is what we're after, let's talk about what that is. What does it mean to be driven? Well, drive is hunger. Drive is how badly you want the feeling you get on the other side of the stimulus. Drive is what turns obstacles into challenges, into a summons to engage and to take action. There's only one obstacle that you need to worry about, and that's a lack of drive. Once people are in high drive, everything else is just a challenge. I mean, a person in high drive can look at a puddle and see the opportunity to experience the joy of weightlessness by jumping over it. A person in high drive views the yawns and dismissiveness of their audience as their cue to up the ante. A person in high drive uses the fuel of a no to make something even more impressive. A person in high drive does not get stopped. Now, people can't operate in a state of high drive all day long, every day, of course. Like all things in life, it has to ebb and flow. But you have to be able to get people aligned and into that state at will whenever it's needed. Again, drive isn't something people have or don't. It's an equation with variables you can change. The equation for drive, or a lack of it, is this: your relative grounding and suppleness, which means your grounding and suppleness in relation to the stimulus. Are you more or less grounded and supple than the stimulus? Grounding is your physical, mental, and emotional centeredness and certainty, and suppleness is your ability to absorb energy. So how you are in relation to the stimulus is very important. The strength of the emotional relevance to you, which is how much stress you have built up around the stimulus, and the stakes, which are the difference between the current and the future state. They're how much more or less access to flow this will give you, and how much better this feels. They're how much more or less strong and light you'll feel, how much more or less stress and confidence you'll have. And combined, these things produce one of four gates for a change in action. The four gates are fear, which is a gate you can't find; stress, which is a gate that won't quite open in either direction; drive away from, which is a wide open gate aiming away from the stimulus; and drive towards, which is a wide open gate aiming towards the stimulus. This is the emotional gate that starts or stops action and gives it direction. Here's how each of the variables affects the gate of emotion. For grounding and suppleness, the more grounded and supple you are with respect to the stimulus, the more free you will be to tackle it because you can move or withstand attack without falling over. Increasing your fortitude will create a safe place from which to move, and increasing your suppleness, physical, mental, and emotional, will make you able to absorb more force without getting knocked down. And the same is true for your people, of course. All of this applies to everyone. The strength of emotional relevance, how much stress you have built up around the issue, dictates how much stored energy is available to tackle the issue. That is a really big concept that we're going to tackle a ton in another module. The entire module is devoted to that. And I'm going to say it one more time here for you to kind of let it sink in a little bit. The strength of emotional relevance, how much stress you have built up around the issue, dictates how much stored energy is available to tackle the issue. So finding a stimulus with higher emotional relevance while simultaneously providing the grounding necessary to help others through it will provide a lot more energy to get the work done, and in a way that makes people feel good. For the stakes, the more vivid the disparity between how you feel now and how you will feel, the more willing you will be to take action, to tackle the issue. Those lead to the emotional gates of fear, stress, drive away from, or drive towards. Now here's an example. We're going to look at 4 scenarios of the same person and event so you can understand how the variables work in all of this. So let's say you have a team member, John, who you just witnessed disobeying the rules again about how to properly hold and carry delicate, expensive product. In scenario 1, John is a big, strong guy who's quick to get angry. His demeanor makes you feel extremely insecure and tense. Your grounding and suppleness in dealing with this is poor. And on top of that, human damage product is costing your company a lot of money. You're being heavily pressured to get handling under control, but you're not good at confronting people, and John knows this. So this really stresses you out. So the emotional relevance to you is very high. On top of that, the last employee that was put on a PIP for careless handling tried to sue the company, and the company felt they had to let the manager go because of it. Given that this could happen to you, your access to flow that employment brings could end, so the stakes are high. When combined, these things overload your system, you lose your sense of self in relation to other, and collapse into fear. Now any action taken is purely instinctual, fight, flight, or freeze. And when this is done from a state of disconnect of self from other, this may or may not save your life in the moment. But even if it does, it always has negative consequences because the disconnect prevents you from ever resolving the action. It prevents you from ever knowing where you stand in relation to the other. And so the stress of that is carried with you as chronic stress until you can figure out how to connect and resolve it. In scenario 2, John is a pretty decent guy and he'll mostly do what you say, but you know that under his breath, he thinks these rules are dumb and that bothers you. You and he are relatively similar in grounding and suppleness and in being able to deal with this issue. For relevance, the human damage product is costing your company a lot of money. You're being heavily pressured to get handling under control, but you're not very good at confronting people. It makes you feel very uncomfortable. So the emotional relevance to you is high. And you know that handling needs to improve and strict rules seem like the way to go, but you also know that strict rules are frequently a big turnoff for your best team members. Enforcing these rules just seems to trade one problem for another, so the stakes are low. There's too much equilibrium there. When combined, these things lead to a state of stress. The emotional relevance to you is high, but there's not enough disparity in the grounding or the stakes for you to know which action to take, so you're stuck. You don't do much of anything, and the stress of the moment becomes chronic stress. You feel like you're hitting a brick wall or like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. In scenario 3, John is a productive, ambitious worker and a nice guy. He's also a strong, efficient, conscientious mover and unlikely ever to damage the product. And he thinks he has a better way of handling it and he doesn't want to change. You like him and feel comfortable around him and kind of agree with him. So you're both well-grounded people, but he's more grounded than you are. On top of that, for relevance, human damage product is costing your company a lot of money and you're being highly pressured to get handling under control. But in this case, you've been told to immediately fire the next person you catch not handling it according to the rules. This feels very wrong to you, so the emotional relevance is high. In addition to that, if you don't fire John, you will be dinged on your review and talked to by HR. But if you do fire John, you'll lose your personal sense of integrity and you'll feel like a failure for not standing up for him and finding a better solution. And you'll lose the respect of all the other hardworking, creative type team members who really form the backbone of your team's unusual success. So the stakes for you are high. Taken together, these things result in you moving well in a state of drive away from John and into confronting your superiors or the system or whatever you need to confront. In this case, whether you win the argument or not, Your access to flow is higher by turning away from John because you, for sure, get to keep the things that allow the most flow for a well-grounded person, which is your integrity and respect. So in this case, you'll feel stronger by turning your energy away from John. In scenario 4, John is a big, strong guy who's quick to get angry. His demeanor makes most of the other team members feel insecure and tense. You, however, are a very grounded person with a great deal of ability to effectively confront all types of people. So your grounding and suppleness relative to John's is very high. For relevance, human damaged product is costing your company a lot of money. You're being heavily pressured to get handling under control. You love working at this company and know that this goal is critical to their success, so you will not tolerate people who interfere with it. So the emotional relevance to you is very high. In addition to that, you have great clarity about when rules are useful and when they're a hindrance, and you have deemed this rule to be highly useful for creating more flow in the system overall. You also see that getting John to accept it would benefit both him and everyone around him. The improvements you'll get if you tackle this successfully are far-ranging, so the stakes are high. And when combined, these things result in your moving well in a state of drive towards John. You see this as a great opportunity to increase your leadership skills even more. It's a perfect opportunity to build rapport with John by handling the situation really well. And when everything turns out great, you'll feel like you're walking on air. Now, an interesting thing to note here that will come into play later in a later training is that the only difference between fear and drive is grounding. Now, you could create these scenarios for every single resistance you and your people encounter. You can't change how the equation works, but you have a ton of control over most of the variables most of the time. You can change the grounding and suppleness. You can change the stimulus that's being used to get a different level of emotional relevance. You can change the stakes by increasing the polarity between current and future states. That's what we're going to be working on throughout this whole 8-week program. If you're the one who can help your team members change the balance of this equation for the better, if you're the one who can help them feel like they're walking on air, they'll be loyal, committed, hardworking, happy followers who will tackle anything. This is also how you get good people to want to work for you instead of for other people, or for your company instead of for other companies. Now, one question I always get is, does this work for everyone? And the answer is yes. These things operate according to the laws of thermodynamics and the constructal law. It's physics. We can go deep into the physics on this if anyone wants to ask me about it in one of the Q&As, but it always works. But you don't always get it right. And it's not always the right thing to do. There are times when you should stop working on this with your people and take other action instead. So here's when to quit. Every leader has certain people that they just can't tolerate, or certain people whose code they just can't crack. And the less experienced you are at this, the more this will happen. And the less grounded and present you are when you're doing this kind of stuff, the more it will happen. If you have that one person that you just can't seem to lead, it's better to move them to another group than to keep the struggle going. But if you find there are a number of people that you can't seem to lead, you really need to increase your leadership skills rather than be getting rid of all those people. And then if someone has high drive but low knowledge and skills, you can work with that. Their drive will get them the knowledge and skills that they need. If someone has high knowledge and skills but low drive, in most cases, you can work with that, using the variables in the equation to increase the drive. But if someone has low knowledge and skills and low drive, the ROI just isn't going to be there. Those people need to be placed somewhere where their knowledge and skills are adequate to make working on the drive worthwhile. Another time is some people sadly have gotten to a place where their drive is buried so deeply within them that it really will require more time or maybe even more skill than you have to bring it out. These people drain you and they drain the group, and they need to be let go, but as tactfully as possible. And lastly, if someone's been placed in a job that's a very bad match for their talents, they'll need to be moved to something that's a better match. Now, you also need to know that the equation always works, but you don't always get it right. The less experienced and less present you are when you're encountering the scenarios, the more often you'll get the variables wrong. People have a lot of nuanced complexity to them that you have to learn to detect and to deal with, and it takes practice. And lastly, you must understand that even though the physics is designed to forever increase flow, it's a dynamic system and things can go wrong. Things that cause decreased access to flow, other than the normal aging process, are mistakes, miscalculation, misinterpretation, misjudgment, and disconnection. We disconnect through fear. We disconnect the mind and the body. We disconnect through the stories we tell ourselves about the future that are rooted in the past, a past disconnect, which makes them usually untrue. This is what self-sabotage is. Decisions based in fear, in disconnect. These are things that can mess up the outcome. All right, so now you know the deepest keys that open the door to getting your team members and yourself to tackle anything. You know that what causes people to back away from things is not having enough drive to overcome inevitable resistances. You can tell that people don't have enough drive by their behavior, by their lack of focus, their distractedness, their shiny object syndrome, by their obsession with petty issues or with people issues that just don't need to be there. By their evasiveness, you can tell this by their lack of forward movement towards a goal. You also know that movement is a transfer of force between people or between people and things. And that transfer of force has 4 different emotional gates that say yay or nay to the action: fear, stress, drive away from, or drive towards. And when people don't show the behavior of drive towards, it's because they feel the balance of the drive equation working against the transfer of force ending in a better access to the flow of energy. So the gate will not fully open towards the goal. You know that this equation has 3 variables: grounding, emotional relevance, and stakes, that as a leader you can influence heavily in order to help people achieve what all people fundamentally want. A greater capacity to keep the movement of life going in a smooth, efficient way forward in the face of any inevitable obstacles. When you use the work at your company to help them achieve that, these people become loyal, committed, happy, hard-working team members. And this is the only way you can lead without resorting to authority. Over the rest of this course, we'll be looking at things we can do to make this equation work for us. A few of these things are how to build fortitude with a mobile fortress, and how to increase mental and emotional suppleness with the 5 roles. The mind-blowing answer to what makes something emotionally relevant and the purpose that serves, and how the stakes are where corporate really goes wrong and what reverse your purpose fixes. But again, for this week, you should just learn to feel these forces at work. Feel stuckness, feel fear, feel drive. When people are in high drive, there are no obstacles. There is nothing that interrupts or stops their action. There are only challenges. There are only things that are a summons to engage, things that are a signal to increase skills, increase focus, increase fortitude, or to take more action. So now back to you. Now you understand the model that explains our behavior, and you have the equation for drive. This is the code that directs the actions of all sentient beings. We cannot act outside of this code because it's the code of life. Life is movement towards greater access to flow. Anything else is dying. And this is why the work of the leader is so beautiful. It's bringing greater life to others. And to do that in the workplace where we spend the majority of our lives is invaluable. The work of your team members is what gives them greater access to flow. Their work is to transfer their energy into a productive goal, like creating a product or service. Your work as a leader is to transfer your energy into the conversion of your team members' energy from stress, fear, and drive away from into drive towards, into the flowing energy of productive work, aligned around a common goal. For the next 8 weeks, I'm going to help you to do that. Now, I'm going to end this training with the concept I introduced the course with, and that is that leadership should be beautiful. Leadership is not coordinating work. It's getting people unstuck. It's helping people to grow. Leadership is turning the stuck energy of stress and fear into the flowing energy of productive work and growth. Leadership is about helping others to move well, and that is why it's beautiful. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. It's in their gut. It's visceral because it's about movement. Beauty is the sensation of unhindered flow. A leader is one who helps people get there. And when we witness a great leader at work, it moves us to tears. And now I see what made the inspiring horse trainer, whose picture I saw at age 11, so beautiful. He understood the code of life. Move well, lead well. Go be a beautiful leader.